This is a vision that is going to lead to a process that's going to engage people of color, and particularly young people of color, to be able to identify their history, and most importantly, their birthright to succeed in this city and in this state. Now, this report, which is a beginning of a process, I believe as the lead researcher and author, is mostly important to the fact that it offers close to 700 primary, secondary source footnotes, which will provide an opportunity for future scholars and future leaders to take this data, to take these historical truths, and build that into the next level of public interpretation, presentations, programs, and most importantly, identity building within our communities of color. And there's some young leaders right here, from Marco to Ray to Shondell, who I hope pick up this mantle and lead this effort going forward. Now, it's impossible for me to go through 400 years of history in about 5 minutes, so read the report. But what I will do is give you some of the highlights of the findings between 1620 and 2020. America's first pandemic, the Great Dying between 1619 and 1919, it wiped out close to 90% of the indigenous population from Maine to Cape Cod. So well before the European settlement and colonization of what we call today New England, Boston, Providence, Newport, New Haven, well before that, many of the indigenous men, women, and children died because there was no modern day health system or technological systems to support them to deal with these newly arriving colonizers who brought with them not only their sense of land, but also disease. So as today we wrestle with this pandemic called COVID, think what it would have been like for the indigenous men, women, and children that had no natural resistance and no medical capability to deal with the first American pandemic, which we call the Great Dying. That Great Dying would set the stage for a fast tracking of colonization, land expansion, and development, unlike any of the time in the history of America. Between 1709 and 1807, Rhode Island merchants, led by Providence, Newport, and Bristol, were responsible for at least 934 documented slave voyages that went from Rhode Island to West Africa, to the West Indies, and back to Rhode Island. We now know through documentation, and this report includes a documentation of every ship, and as much information as far as the number of Africans that were transported, and other products and goods, and most importantly, those owners of the vessels that were some of the leading families of Providence, Bristol, and Newport. During that 100-year period of time, which scholars at the time would call our golden age, transported, we believe, at least 150,000 African men, women, and children. In Rhode Island's case, mostly children, largely to the West Indies, but eventually back to Rhode Island. The detribalization of the indigenous people, mostly represented by the Narragansett tribe, has been a constant challenge over 400 years. And in fact, if history can teach us anything, the Narragansett tribe of Rhode Island may be some of the most resilient people who have ever walked the earth. Despite the best efforts of Rhode Island governments to disband the tribe and deny their selfhood, the Narragansetts have maintained their identity as the first people of Rhode Island, along with a number of other indigenous tribes. It's also important to recognize that for the first 350 years of our state's history, 90% of the non-white population were African heritage people. Not Latino, not Asian, not seniors, not gays, but African heritage. So when we talk in terms of racialized discrimination, violence, neighborhood destruction, lack of access to basic housing, employment, livelihood, it is almost exclusively dedicated and focused upon African heritage people. And that's an incredibly important fact to understand, because many of us today who benefit from the social justice and equal rights and civil rights laws and policies, it all came on the backs and the shoulders that we stand on of African heritage men, women, and children. During the 20th century, Providence and Rhode Island African heritage residents lived in what we call a Jim Crow tradition. The extraordinary circumstances where if you happened to be black in Providence in 1950, the opportunities for safe housing, a quality job, or a quality education was far and few between, as compared to if you had lived in Mississippi or South Carolina or Virginia. While those southern states in the 20th century had Jim Crow laws, Rhode Island government, municipal government, private business practices consistently maintained Jim Crow traditions. Publicly sanctioned urban redevelopment, urban renewal programs in the mid-20th century were specifically targeted to largely African heritage and limited income communities. The level of deconstruction and disruptions was nearly complete. In those communities today, which are recognized as Fox Point, College Hill, Mount Hope, Lippert Hill, West Elmwood, Upper South Providence, were almost completely depopulated of its largely historic African heritage and other people of color and limited working people. And I want to be fair, this was not only going on in Providence, Rhode Island, it was going on across the country. And it would be the great 20th century author James Baldwin would coin the term, it's not urban renewal, it's Negro removal. And the extraordinary circumstance of Negro removal in 20th century Providence had as much of a negative impact on the very existence of African heritage people as compared to enslavement a century and a half before. And then the final point, which I think is one of the most important points of the study, a zip code address should not determine a child's access to quality education. The educational achievement gaps between urban students and suburban students, and the achievement gaps between African heritage and now Latino and white students may well be one of the most important civil rights issues in the 21st century. So this study is a starting point. It begins the process of engaging community organizations such as the Reconciliation Center and many others. It's led by the interpretation of the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society, because many of the collections that you see here today come from these great historical institutions that we have within this city and in this state. And they're waiting for scholars, they're waiting for the next generation of leaders to take this report, to take the data, engage these societies, and bring these stories and this truth to the larger public. So it's been an honor to be a part of this process. It's a privilege. My kids are 9th generation Rhode Islanders, and I thought I knew most, and this was a learning and a painful learning experience for my own self. But I'm excited of the vision going forward, led by the mayor and the African American Advisory Committee. The reconciliation process will be unlike anything else. And what's most important about the process is it's open to all. It's available to all, so that all of us have the opportunity to learn together and build a better city and a better state and a better nation for all, regardless of race, ethnicity, nation origin, sexual orientation, an opportunity for all of us to benefit. So again, thank you, Mayor, and we look forward to this next great step. Thank you.